So, hey, getting into it. When we first became pastors, I really struggled with feeling not equipped for the role. Has anyone ever struggled with that? You don't feel equipped when you're stepping into something, right? It's kind of a new thing. But I knew that God calls the unequipped and then equips them. So we just kind of went along with it, right? We're kind of like, we're going to go on this ride with you, Lord. Equip us along the way. Strap in, let's go. And that's kind of what happened. If you know much about our journey, if you've been around here for a little while, then you might know that when we became pastors was during the period of COVID. So it was a crazy transition from our previous senior pastors to us. I wanted, when we finally decided to become pastors, when we said yes to the call, I really wanted a slow, long transition. That was like my one condition to Pastor David. I was like, no, I really want a slow transition because I'm going to need some time to learn how to do this thing. I don't know the first thing about pastoring, right? So there I was. This happened, and then COVID hit. So we had this beautiful transition plan put together. It was laid out. It was so careful. It was brilliant. It was a 2-year plan where we would slowly increase in workload and kind of learn as we went and get mentored to become pastors. And then our lead pastors headed over to the other side of the country at the time and got locked out of the border. So that made things very, very, very tricky for us. So we were kind of thrust into it very quickly. But I remember this feeling of just feeling inadequate. I just remember this feeling of going, man, I'm not cut out for this. I don't even know the first thing about this. How do I do this? What do I do? What do I do? How many know that sometimes our plans aren't God's plan, right? How many times has that happened in your world, I wonder? So really quickly, our plans of this 2-year transition got sidelined. And in 2021, we were thrown into the deep end, having to step up over what felt like almost overnight due to border closures and all sorts of stuff. But I knew that in this moment, like I said before, that God calls the unequipped, but it didn't stop me feeling really inadequate in this calling, right? And I felt that for far too long. I felt I didn't have the skills I needed. And up until this point in my life, I'd been working in the performing arts sector. So if a lot of you guys know the Matt Dan Theatre and Cinema, that's where I was hanging out for probably well over a decade. I love that place. And that's where I was working. I was a theatre manager there. And God didn't put me there by accident. That's the crazy thing about all of this. Because what does a theatre manager do? Actually, before that, I was in this place of being inadequate, and I was kind of feeling that. And then one day God spoke to me. And this is what he said, right? He said, I didn't put you there by accident. What does a theatre manager do? He said, you program presentations on a stage. You program them that challenge people, specifically curate content that challenges people, helps them grow from a new perspective. Then he said, you help to build stronger communities. You manage a team. You steward someone else's money. We're in local government, right? You manage a building, toilets, tech. And he said to me in that moment, just do it for me. That's all I've called you to do as a pastor. I've already equipped you. I've equipped you for this. It might not look exactly the same, but God had equipped me for well before I realized it. Before I even became a Christian, I was working there. Isn't it amazing how God weaves together our stories to make things work? I didn't even understand his plan at that point. I didn't even get it. And maybe you've experienced this as well. I think too often we judge people by their covers, right? You know how that saying goes, don't judge a book by its cover? I think sometimes that happens. And maybe you've had moments where someone is expecting something of you or you're expecting something of someone else. And maybe it hits harder than most because maybe of the situations and experiences that you've been through in that time. Because you see, we've all got a backstory. We've all got a backstory. But I think the Lord intentionally curates our backstory to equip us for what comes next. And that's what we're going to talk about this morning. Now, God willing, we're going to spend a few weeks journeying through the story of Moses. And I just want to illustrate some of what I'm talking about with this backstory thing today. And in our locating text, Exodus 3, 10 and 11, I love how God took Moses out of slavery. He took his people, took the Israelites out of slavery. He actually took Moses out of slavery to start with. He did some stuff in him, and then he sends him back in there. Everyone say, back in there. Back in there. Awesome. And I think this happens to us as well. I think there's a pattern here because God calls us. We get saved, we come to church, we learn about him, we develop a relationship with him, and then he sends us back into our old life again, doesn't he? How many people have experienced that? God sends you back into your old life, only this time we're different. We're in a different place because now we're called to be in the world, not of the world, right? And that's really important. That's an incredibly important fact to get around. But he only does this once we're strong enough in our faith that we're actually ready to go there so that we're not going to fall into the same old traps again, right? So to really understand this, let's go back to the start of Moses' life, and we need to get some of his backstory. Everyone say backstory. Backstory. We're going to get back to the backstory of Moses. So before Moses was even born, right? This is before he was even born. There was a group of people living in Egypt called the Israelites. Who's heard of the Israelites? Most people have read some of this story at least, and I think this is an incredible story in the Bible. But these guys, these Israelites, had grown really quickly in numbers, and they became really mighty and really powerful. Now Joseph, who was their ancestor, had a really great relationship with Pharaoh, the king of the time. But eventually, though, all his family died out, Joseph died, generations moved on, and over time, a new king came into power who had no idea about this relationship between Joseph and Pharaoh. I keep calling him Joseph, like Jesus. How does that work? Joseph. Everyone say there's always a backstory. There's always a backstory. See, the new king felt really threatened by the Israelites, and he was worried that because there were so many of them, that they would join with the enemies and actually overthrow him and take over the land. So he made the Israelites slaves to the Egyptians. The Egyptians then forced the Israelite slaves to build cities, and they made the Israelites live really bitter lives. That's what the Bible says. It says they lived bitter lives and that they were ruthless in all their demands of the Israelites. Now, even though they were his slaves, Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, continued to feel really threatened and gave a command to the midwives that would ensure any Israelite boys that were born were killed instantly. Now, that's pretty heavy. That's full-on stuff. But if it was a girl, they could live. But the good news is the midwives of this time actually feared God. They feared God more than they feared Pharaoh. And that's a good, healthy place to be, isn't it? Isn't it good to fear God more than man? I think that's important. So they actually disobeyed Pharaoh's orders and let the boys live. And Pharaoh eventually said, well, fine, throw every newborn Hebrew boy into the Nile River and you can let the girls live. So then it's at that point where we get to enter Moses. Moses was born into this time. This is when he arrived on the scene. So Moses was born as an Israelite into slavery. But I love this part. But Moses' mum saw that he was a special baby. And so she managed to keep him hidden for 3 months. How do you keep a newborn baby hidden for 3 months? Does anyone know how loud a newborn baby is? Has anyone experienced that in their lives? How did she possibly do it? I wonder if she was pretending that he was a girl. I wonder how that worked. But Moses' mum was an absolute genius. We don't even know her name here, but man, check this out. This is so cool. Exodus 2:3 says this. It says, but when she could no longer hide him, she got a basket made of papyrus reeds and waterproofed it with tar and pitch. And she put the baby in the basket and laid it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile River. The baby's sitter then stood at a distance, watching to see what would happen. And soon Pharaoh's daughter came down to bathe in the river. Pharaoh's daughter, right? And her attendants walked along the riverbank. When the princess saw the basket among the reeds, she sent her maid to get it for her. And when the princess opened it, she saw a baby. The little boy was crying, and she felt sorry for him. Now this must be one of the Hebrew or Israelite children, she said. Then the baby's sitter approached the princess. And of course, she wouldn't have known that this person was actually her sister. His sister, sorry. Moses' sister was the sitter. And she asked, should I go and find one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you? She asked. Yes, do, the princess replied. So the girl went and called the baby's mother. Take the baby and nurse him for me. The princess told the baby's mother, I will pay you for your help. So the woman took the baby home and nursed him. Now later, when the boy was older, his mother brought him back to Pharaoh's daughter, who adopted him as her own son. And the princess named him Moses, for she explained, I lifted him out of the water. Now that's incredible. What's incredible about this? Did you catch it? Moses' mum found a way to keep Moses alive by making the princess think she'd found a random boy that needed to be looked after. Then with the help of her daughter being in the right place at the right time, managed to trick the princess into letting her take care of her own son so he could stay alive. Genius. Isn't that crazy? But this backstory actually changes so much about Moses' story, and we're going to get to that in a minute. But everyone say, the blessing is in the backstory. Can we just take a second to honour all the resourceful mums in the room today? Can we have a huge round of applause for all the resourceful mums that are here today? Shout out to all the mums who have been keeping your kids alive, because that's not an easy thing, is it? That's it. Some days it feels like a feat, but man, you're still standing. You're still going. It's amazing. So from here on, Moses grows up. And he grows up as the son of a princess and also as Pharaoh's grandson. He's basically adopted as Pharaoh's grandson. And the thing is here, most of us don't realize this because we think of Moses later on in life when he's, at the burning bush and that kind of thing. And he's kind of babbling with his words a bit. And we're like, oh, I don't know what's going on with him. But he would have had an amazing education. He's in the house of Pharaoh. And it changes your picture of Moses when you get this picture of him. Because he had this amazing education. He was probably very intelligent and taught very well. He almost led this double life where he lived in both camps. He grew up in the house of Pharaoh, the king of the land. He would have had an amazing education. He would have been fed so well. He would have had opportunities that he never would have got if he was an Israelite who was born into slavery. So then Moses grew up, and many years later, he went back to visit his own people, the Hebrews, or as we know them, the Israelites. And he saw how hard they were forced to work. Now, this would have been so conflicting for him, right? Because he knew that he was one of them. He knew that he was an Israelite. He knew that's where he was born, but somehow he was given this other life. He was given this other life to live, even though the two were enemies. What a tricky spot to be in. Verse 11 says, many years later, when Moses had grown up, he went out to visit his own people, the Hebrews, and he saw how hard they were forced to work. Now, during his visit, he saw an Egyptian beating one of his fellow Hebrews or Israelites. After looking in all directions to make sure no one was watching, Moses killed the Egyptian and hid the boy in the sand. That's pretty hardcore. I was watching a message by one of my favorite preachers, Mr. Stephen Furtick, this week, and he spoke on this passage, actually. And I love what he highlighted. He highlighted this. He said that Moses, in this moment, felt a deep burden to stand up for his people, the Israelites. And in this moment, he then took it into his own hands and he did it his own way without God's blessing on it. So that's what happened there. He felt that this was his time to stand up for his people, but his time had not come yet. So where did that leave him? Well, verse 13 says, the next day when Moses went out to visit his people again, he saw two Hebrew men fighting. Why are you beating up your friend? Moses said to the one who started the fight. So this was two Israelite people now fighting together. And the man replied, who appointed you to be our prince and judge? Are you going to kill me as you killed the Egyptian yesterday? Then Moses was afraid, thinking, everyone knows what I did. But here's the thing, they didn't know Moses' backstory in this moment. They didn't understand that he was actually one of them. They probably just saw this guy as this spoiled, rotten prince from the kingdom who's come to their land, right? They probably had no idea that he was on their side and that he had a deep burden to set them free. And sure enough, verse 15, Pharaoh heard what had happened and he tried to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and went on to live in the land of Midian. Now, remembering he grew up in the house of Pharaoh, Pharaoh was almost like his grandfather. So this would have been a big deal. Imagine the guy that's helped to bring you up is suddenly trying to chase you to kill you. That's essentially his adopted grandfather. So when Moses arrives in Midian, he sat down beside a well. And now the priests of Midian had 7 daughters who came as usual to draw water and fill the water troughs for their father's flocks. But some other shepherds came across and chased them away. So Moses jumped up and rescued the girls from the shepherds, and he drew water for their flocks. When the girls returned to Reuel, and Reuel is actually also Jethro. If anyone's following along, this is the same guy. Their father, he asked, why are you back so soon today? An Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds, they answered. And then he drew water for us and watered our flocks. Where is he then, the father asked. Why did you leave him there? Invite him to come and eat with us. So Moses accepted the invitation and he settled there with him. And in time, Reuel gave Moses his daughter Zipporah to be his wife. So later, she gave birth to a son and Moses named him Gershom, for he explained, I have been a foreigner in a foreign land. And that name, Gershom, actually means stranger or exile. So Moses named him after what he had been through. But I like in the passage there how it says, Moses has been a foreigner He says, I have been a foreigner in a foreign land, because that's a past tense, right? Been means past tense. Now that means mentally at least Moses had moved on. That's the way I read that. That's the way I see it, is that Moses had now moved on to the next thing. And it's going to be important in a minute. Because this would have actually felt like the end for Moses. He'd been on the run for killing a man, right? He'd finally got there. And then he'd settled in this new area in Midian. He'd planned for an end to his life there. He'd planned to settle down. He'd planned to hang out in the countryside with his new wife and his new kids. Because you see, his backstory is that he'd killed a man, but now he'd finally found a new beginning. He had the opportunity to put down roots in this place. But what I find interesting again is that no one around there would have known his backstory. No one would have known what he'd been through by that point. He could settle down, he could get away from his past mistakes and start again. But then, everyone say, but then, the Bible has a plot twist for Moses' life. Of course. Verse 23, years passed and the king of Egypt died, but the Israelites continued to groan under the burden of slavery, and they cried out for help, and their cry rose up to God. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And he looked down on the people of Israel and knew it was time to act. Now, I'm not taking credit for discovering this part too, because again, my favorite pastor, Stephen Pertick, says this. In the next chapter, Exodus 3, it actually goes straight on to the next part of the story, which we'll read in a minute. But the text between Exodus 2 and Exodus 3 just continue on. It just continues on like it's the next day in the story. It just says literally, one day Moses was tending to the flock of his father-in-law Jethro. But what's interesting here is in the book of Acts, Stephen actually gives an account for the life of Moses. And get this, let's backtrack a little. Let's go deeper inside Moses' backstory for a second. And this is what it says in Acts 7, 23 and 24. One day